The storm came sideways across the plains like a living thing. Snow flung by a wind that clawed at a man's breath and made the sky vanish into a howl. Elias pulled his scarf higher, kept the roan's head pushed into it, counting fence posts he could no longer see. He was feeling for the old creek cut with his knees, as though the land itself might speak through leather and bone when a man's sight failed him. He'd thought he could reach the north pasture before the drifts swallowed the gate whole, just to check on the heifers that calved too early. But the wind, it had other ideas. It changed, and something else found him first. It was a shape where no shape should be, just a dark hump against a world of pure, blown white. As he got closer, the horse shied, setting its feet hard. It was a wagon. Tipped on its side, the tongue snapped clean like a broken arm. One wheel was still turning, slow and eerie, like a prayer wheel in the wind. A quilt, half buried in the snow, fluttered like a wounded bird. He swung down from the saddle, the cold biting through his denim and straight into his marrow. He waded through the drift toward the wreck, his gloved hand reaching, testing for any sign of life under the canvas. His voice came out small, eaten by the weather. "Ho there! Anyone?" The wind just took the words and threw them right back in his face. But then he heard it. From under that fluttering quilt came a sound. It was so thin he might have imagined it if the horse hadn't pricked its ears straight up. A whimper, the sound a pup makes when it's dreaming of chasing rabbits. Except this was no pup. He flung the quilt aside, and there she was, a little girl, curled up tight like a fist. Her boots were stiff with ice. Her hair was rimed white, where tears had frozen right at the corners of her eyes. Her lips were blue, parted around a breath that rattled like dry paper. "Easy," he said, though his own heart jolted so hard he thought it might bruise his ribs. He slid his arms beneath her, feeling that terrible lightness that isn't mercy, but a warning. Under the cold, he felt the heat of a fever, like a fire banked under ash, just waiting to burn out. She gasped as he moved her, and she clutched something at her throat. She held it with a strength that didn't belong to a body so far gone. Her small fist was locked tight over a glint of metal on a frayed ribbon. "Hush," Elias murmured, drawing her close against his chest. He turned his back to the wind, trying to give her whatever warmth a single man could make against a prairie's absolute cruelty. He scanned the broken wagon again. No team, no other bodies, just the scatter of a life spilled out into the snow. A tin cup, a child's shoe, small and worn, a Bible, its pages stuck wet and freezing into a single, pale leaf. He knew what a storm like this did to the lost, and he knew how much time it allowed before it made its own final decisions. He climbed back into the saddle, the girl cradled against him. He tucked her inside his coat so her face was pressed against the rough wool, and his own chin bent down to shelter the crown of her head. The roan shouldered into the wind as if it, too, understood there were miles and minutes left to fight for. "Keep with me," he said to her, not even sure if she could hear him. Her eyes fluttered, and that little fist at her throat tightened on the metal thing, as if it were a second heartbeat she could carry in her hand. The land blurred into a swirl of white in motion, but he found the creek cut by feel, the line of cottonwoods by memory, and at last the low dark shape of his ranch house, shouldering up from the drift like an arc in a white sea. He hit the ground running, shouldered the door open with his hip, and the storm followed him inside in a swirl of ice and fury before he could slam it shut behind them. The room replaced the wind's howl with its own noises, the pop and crackle of the stove, the skitter of blown snow across the floorboards, his own breath in the horses, ghosting in the yard outside. He laid the girl on the buffalo robe by the hearth, stripped off his gloves with his teeth, and fumbled for the kettle. "Stay with me, little one," he said, and the words rasped in his throat like he hadn't used them in years. When the heat finally reached her cheeks, they flushed a faint, terrible rose. Her lashes trembled against her skin. And then he saw it. He saw plain what her little fist had been guarding so fiercely. It was a locket, dull silver, but faithful. The hinge was blackened with age, the face of it worn smooth where a thumb had worried it over 1,000 miles. For a single heartbeat, the room tilted on its axis. The light from the stove flared too bright, burning his eyes. Because he knew that locket. He knew it the way he knew the scar on his own knuckle. He had bought it in Abilene, with money he couldn't spare. He had fastened it around Clara's throat the night she laughed, wearing a white dress on this very floor. And he had held it in his palm the morning they told him she was dead. His hand hovered over the child's tiny locked grip. He didn't touch it. He couldn't. "Where did you?" he began, but his voice failed him. The girl's lips moved soundlessly, as if the storm had stolen all her words too. Outside, the wind leaned hard against the shutters, like a man trying the latch. Inside, the locket shone in the fire's blink, and Elias felt the world he had buried so deep rise up from under the snow, like something that would not, could not, stay lost. The fire snapped and hissed as Elias crouched close. Steam was rising from the girl's damp hair, where melting frost bled into strands the color of straw. And still her hand clutched that little locket so fiercely he could see the tendons stand out, white and stark, in her wrist. He had not laid eyes on that piece of silver in a year, not since they'd pulled that torn ribbon from the riverbank. Yet every single detail leaped at him now, clear as day. The small dent near the top, where a saddle buckle once struck it. The smudge of tarnish near the clasp. The tiny, faint etching of two wild flowers that Clara had traced with her fingernail the night he gave it to her. "This way," she'd said, her voice full of laughter. "I'll carry your hand on my heart wherever I go." He had buried that memory with her, or he thought he had. He'd buried it the day the sheriff told him her carriage had gone off the river road, that the swollen waters had taken her, and that there was no trace left but that single ribbon, and a grief that hollowed him out like a house left open to the storm. And now here it was, gleaming between the shaking fingers of a child who should have no claim to it at all. He reached for her hand, gentle as he knew how. He just wanted to see. He had to be sure. But the moment his fingers brushed the locket, she gasped. Her eyes flew open, the pupils wide and dark, her face pale with cold and fever. She tried to sit up, her voice a cracked, dry whisper. Mama said, Mama said, never, never let them take it." Elias steadied her by the shoulder, gently pressing her back down onto the robe. "Easy, little one. You're safe here." His throat tightened around the words. It felt like a lie. He had no notion what hands had taken her mother, or why the locket, Clara's locket, should now be clutched in hers. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. But she just shook her head, her teeth chattering, clutching the ribbon even tighter. "Sadie," she managed at last. The word broke into a cough that bent her whole small frame in two. Elias held a mug of warm water to her lips, watching her drink in tiny, desperate swallows. His own breath was uneven, catching in his chest. He had thought himself past hope, past faith, past all things but the endless cycle of work and sleep, and the constant dull ache of an empty bed. And yet here it was. Flesh and blood, proof that Clara's story had not ended where the river said it did. He fought the urge to shake the child, to demand answers from a body half broken by the snow. He knew questions could wait. Life could not. He laid more wood on the fire, tucked another quilt around her shivering form, and sat back on his heels. He just stared at the locket, glinting in the fire's glow. The picture inside would be Clara's face. He could almost see it through the silver. He had kissed that tiny likeness so often, the paint had nearly faded away completely. "How did you come by this, Sadie? Who gave it to you? Where is she?" The questions burned in his mind, but he kept them banked behind his teeth. The girl's breathing was shallow and quick, her lashes trembling against her cheeks as if the fever was dragging her down into places he could not follow. He wet a cloth and pressed it gently to her brow, murmuring words he had not spoken since the night Clara left for that fateful trip. They were just fragments of prayers, broken promises of care he thought he'd never have to make again. The storm still battered the shutters outside, but inside the cabin, another storm was gathering, one that had nothing to do with wind or snow. It was the storm of a man who thought his past was buried deep and now saw it shining, bright and undeniable, from the hand of a child. The coin of memory he had tried so hard to spend down to nothing had just clinked sharp and new again, and it was demanding a reckoning. He sat there in the firelight, his jaw set hard, his hand hovering above the locket he could not bring himself to take. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the blizzard, that his heart had just begun to bleed for answers it had no right to ask. Sadie stirred restlessly beneath the quilt. Her small frame twitched as though her dreams were dragging her right back out into the storm she'd barely survived. Elias kept the cloth cool on her brow, listening to the words she muttered, fragments broken and scattered by the fever. Mama, run. Don't let them. The men. Each syllable struck him like a spur digging into his side. But when her eyes fluttered open again, they were glazed, yet searching. He leaned close, keeping his voice as steady as he could. Sadie, listen to me. You're safe. No one here is going to take the locket from you. Her hand flew to her throat at once, clutching it tight, and she shook her head weakly. Mama said, don't ever let them touch it. She said it was Papa's. The word caught in her throat, half swallowed, half spoken. Elias's chest tightened as though iron bands were cinching around his ribs, squeezing the air out. Papa's? He wanted to ask her again, to make her say it one more time to be certain, but her gaze slipped away toward the fire, and her lips began to tremble. They came for us, she whispered, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. Men on horses? They wanted Mama. They said she had to come with them. She coughed hard then, a racking sound that seemed to nearly choke her. Elias lifted her, steadying her frail body until the fit passed. It's all right, he murmured, though the storm raging in his heart screamed that nothing was all right. Nothing would ever be all right again. Tell me when you can. Sadie clung to his shirt, her tiny fingers knotting the rough fabric. Mama said to run. She pushed me toward the wagon, told me to hide. But they caught her. I saw them take her. I heard her cry out. And then I ran. Her voice cracked, breaking into sobs that were raw and pitiful. Elias pressed her against his chest, his own eyes burning, the smoke from the stove stinging them. For a year, for one whole year, he had pictured Clara's last breath happening beneath black, rushing water, her face lost forever to the current. Now the truth was rising up, delivered by the fevered words of a child. She had not drowned. She had been taken. Rage flared hot and fierce, so powerful it made his hands shake as he held the little girl. But beneath it lay a sharper, colder edge of guilt. He had mourned while she lived. He had buried her in his heart while she was somewhere out there, crying out for him. Sadie, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Did Mama tell you anything else? About where they took her? The girl just shook her head, tears streaking the grime on her cheeks. I just ran and ran. The snow came. The wagon broke. I thought I was going to die. Her hand slipped from his shirt back to the locket again, clutching it with all the desperation of a drowning soul reaching for a rope. Elias stared at the tarnished silver, seeing Clara's face behind the metal as clear as if she stood right there before him. His thoughts churned, dark and ugly. Outlaws, maybe. Or a land feud. Old enemies who had sworn vengeance the year he married her. Men he thought were just full of hot air and whiskey. The pieces started falling into place, jagged and cruel, until his jaw locked so tight he thought it might crack. Rest now, he said at last, forcing his voice to be low and calm for her sake. You've carried this far enough. He laid her gently back on the robe, tucking the quilt in close around her. But as he drew his hand away, she caught his wrist with a surprising, feverish strength. Don't let them take me, too, she pleaded, her eyes wide and unnaturally bright. Elias's throat closed around the promise that was rising there, but he forced it free. They'll not lay a hand on you, not while I draw breath. She released him then, her small body finally relaxing as she drifted back into an uneasy sleep. But her words bound him like iron chains. Elias sat back by the fire, just staring at the storm still hammering the shutters, watching the shadows leap and dance across the floorboards. He had thought grief was a grave, something you dug once and then, eventually, you walked away from. Now he saw it was a trail of blood and lies, and he had only just walked the first mile. Somewhere out in that snow, Clara still lived, and men still held her. And if fate, or God, or whatever you want to call it, had brought her child to his door, then it had also placed a rifle back in his hands. The storm eased by morning. The wind dropped to a low, mournful moan that sifted snow against the door in pale, silent drifts. But inside Elias's cabin, the air pressed heavy, thick with truths that had not been welcome for a long, long time. Sadie slept fitfully, one hand still curled around the locket, as though her small body would unravel if she ever let it go. Elias stood at the window, staring out toward the frozen horizon, his reflection pale in the frost-edged glass. And in it, he saw not just himself, but Clara's eyes. He saw them the day she told him about the feud that shadowed her family name. Her brothers, greedy and cruel, had claimed inheritance from land that was not rightfully theirs. And when she defied them, when she chose to marry Elias, a man with nothing but a small ranch and his own two hands, they swore she'd pay. They swore she'd pay with misery. He had dismissed it as anger, a bluff meant to scare him off. But then the carriage accident came, and in his grief, he had believed the river swallowed her. He had let himself believe it. Now hearing Sadi's cracked words about men on horseback, he saw the truth his grief had blinded him to. They had taken her. They had staged the whole thing. They'd kept her hidden all this time, perhaps up in the hills where outlaws and scum hold up when the winter snows bar the law from reaching them. His hand curled into a fist against the windowsill, his nails biting through the callus on his palm. He had lived a year as a widower, building fences, branding cattle, sleeping alone in a bed that was always too large, too cold, while Clara lived, while she lived in chains, or worse. He turned as Sadie coughed, her face flushed with fever. He hurried to her side, pressing the cool cloth to her brow again, whispering, "Easy now, little one." Her lips moved, her eyes half-lidded, and she murmured words that chilled him to the bone. They said, they said Mama belonged to them now, that Papa wouldn't come. Elias swallowed hard, forcing a steadiness into his tone that he did not feel. "I'm here now." Her eyes fluttered open, searching his face with a fever-glazed intensity. "Will you find her?" The question pierced him deeper than any blade ever could. He hesitated for only a second, but the weight of the locket, gleaming between them, felt like a vow he had already spoken. "Yes," he said, his voice low but certain. "I'll find her." She smiled faintly, a ghost of a smile, and drifted back into sleep. But Elias remained kneeling, his hand resting near hers, the oath burning like a brand in his chest. He rose after a time, stoked the fire high, and moved to the old trunk at the foot of his bed. From beneath a stack of spare blankets, he pulled out the rifle he had not carried since the day he buried his heart by a river that held no body. Dust coated the barrel, but the steel was true. And as he ran a cloth over it, he felt the old, familiar strength stir in his arms. He checked the cartridges, counting each one as though they were steps on a road he could not, would not turn back from now. Outside, the snow lay smooth and unbroken, a clean white slate, but he knew its prints led somewhere, somewhere beyond his sight. They led to the men who carried Clara away, the men who thought a storm and a year could keep him caged in his own sorrow. He strapped on his coat, checked his saddle gear, and then he paused at the hearth. He stood there, watching Sadie breathe her shallow breaths beneath the quilt. He could not leave her, not with the fever still burning in her veins, not alone, with wolves prowling the timberline and the world as cold as it was. He sank back into his chair, his elbows on his knees, torn between a burning rage and a solemn duty. The locket winked in the firelight, drawing his eye again and again. He whispered into the silence of the room, "Clara, if you still breathe, you hold on. Your girl found me, and I'll not fail you twice." The flames crackled, the storm pressed at the shutters, and the oath of a broken man turned into a promise, forged in snow and ice. Through the long, dark night, Sadi's fever rose. Her cheeks flushed a deep scarlet against the pale quilt. Her small body was racked with shivers, though sweat beaded on her brow like tiny jewels. Elias sat beside her, dipping the cloth into cool water again and again, wringing it out with hands that had once roped steers and swung axes with ease, but now trembled under the immense weight of a single child's life. Each time he pressed the damp rag to her forehead, she stirred, whispering those half-coherent fragments that twisted his gut into knots. "Mama's singing. Don't let them. Papa will come." The words came like sparks from a dying fire, brief and painful, until his chest ached with the certainty that Clara had kept his memory alive for her daughter, feeding her hope even while she was in captivity. He leaned closer, his voice hoarse, whispering, "I'm here, Sadie. I'm here. I'll not leave you." Still she tossed and turned, clutching the locket so fiercely he feared she'd cut her own skin with its sharp edge. Elias brewed a bitter tea from willow bark, coaxing it between her lips, praying over each and every swallow, though prayer had long soured in his mouth since the day he'd lost Clara. By dawn, her breathing had eased just a fraction. It was still shallow, but it was steadier. He sagged against the back of the chair, exhaustion pulling at his bones like a physical weight. Yet he did not sleep. He couldn't. He knew that the fever was only half the battle. Without food, proper medicine, and safety, she would not last another day. He rose, his joints cracking, pulling on his coat and stepping outside into the brittle morning air. Snow lay deep across the yard, the drifts piled up like walls against the cabin. But the storm had passed, and the world lay painfully clear, the distant hills sharp and black against the pale blue sky. He shoveled a path to the barn, fed the roan, and gathered what stores he had left. The lard was thin. The beans, salt, pork, and flour were all running low. Not nearly enough for a child's recovery. His jaw set hard. Supplies meant a trip to town, and the town meant questions. Folks in these parts had long tongues, and the news of a stranger child in Elias's cabin, clutching Clara's locket, would travel faster than a prairie fire in a high wind. It would get back to her brothers. He knew it would, yet he had no choice. He saddled the roan, loaded the rifle into its scabbard, and stood for a long moment at the doorway of his cabin, watching Sadie breathe on the buffalo robe. He whispered, "Hold on, little one," and shut the door softly against the biting cold. The ride into town took hours. The snow was deep and the horse had to work for every step, but it was steady. Elias kept his eyes sharp. Every stand of timber looked like a place outlaws might linger. His mind burned with the story Sadie had gasped out. Men on horses, mama taken, a command to run. He pictured the faces of Clara's kin, the hard-mouthed brothers who had sworn he'd never keep her, and the shadows of the men who worked for them, men paid in whiskey and violence. The rage simmered under his ribs, a constant burning heat, but fear threaded through it now. A cold, sharp fear that every mile he rode away from the cabin was a mile Clara remained in chains. In town, folks eyed him wearily as he dismounted, their usual chatter dimming as he passed. Widow Barlow at the mercantile clucked her tongue. "You look worn, Elias. Not much of a winter left in you, is there?" He just grunted, gathering flour, salt, and herbs for the fever. She frowned when she saw the willow bark. "You nursing a sickness?" His jaw tightened. "Just a chill." He paid and left quick, feeling their eyes follow him down the street. The road home felt twice as long, the shadows stretching out like grasping fingers. He pushed the roan hard, his heart drumming with a desperate urgency. When the cabin finally came into sight, smoke was rising from the chimney, and a wave of relief surged through him, until he stepped inside and saw Sadie's face, still flushed with fever, her lips parted in a shallow, worrying gasp. The locket gleamed at her throat, a constant, silent reminder of the vow he could no longer postpone. Elias sank to his knees beside her, brushing the damp hair from her brow, and swore aloud to the silent room. "I'll find her, Sadie. I swear it. I'll bring your mother back or die in the trying." His voice cracked like the timbers under the weight of the snow, but the oath stood as heavy and real as the rifle laid across his lap. The fever held through another long night, and Elias sat with the rifle across his knees, listening to Sadie's shallow breaths. Each one was a reminder that time was slipping from them like sand through his fingers. When dawn broke, cold and blue, she stirred. She was just lucid enough to whisper, "Mama's not gone. They kept her in the dark house." He leaned close, his own voice steady but with a fire burning inside. "Where, Sadie? Where is this house?" She shivered, her hand clutching the locket, her eyes glassy with fever. Near the hills, where the river bends, they said Papa would never come. And then she slipped back into the fever's grip, leaving him with only those broken fragments. But it was enough. Elias rose, every muscle in his body tense, and stoked the fire until it roared. Then he packed the saddlebag with what little food he had and the rest of the cartridges for the rifle. He hesitated at the door, looking back at the small figure lost beneath the pile of quilts. He could not leave her alone, not in her state. Yet to do nothing was to let both Clara and Sadie slip away from him for good. He thought of his neighbors, of the men in town. He didn't trust any of them with a child, and certainly not with a secret that could unravel everything and get them all killed. His jaw tightened into a hard line. There was only one way. He would take her with him, even though the storm's teeth had not yet dulled. He wrapped her in wool blankets, bound her securely against his chest with another blanket tied around them both, and mounted the roan, the rifle slung across his back. The cold bit hard, but he pressed on, each hoofstep crunching into the deep drifts that glittered beneath a pale, watery sun. The land stretched out, endless and white, but he followed the bends of the river, the line of timber that broke the prairie like old scars. He followed the half-remembered warnings Clara's brothers had snarled at him so long ago, about keeping her blood tied to theirs, no matter the cost. The miles dragged on. Saddie's weight was heavy against him, her shallow breath warming a small patch on his coat. Her small fingers, even in her feverish sleep, were tangled in the locket's ribbon. By midday he saw it, a thin feather of smoke against the sky ahead. It was faint, but it was certain, curling up from the breaks near the hills. Elias reined in the roan, his eyes narrowing. A cabin crouched there, half hidden among the pines, with horses tied in the lee of the wind and shadows moving inside. It had the look of outlaws, 3, maybe 4 of them. It was a place Clara could be kept, a place she could be hidden from the world. The rage burned hot in his throat, but he checked it, knowing that fury without a plan was just a death warrant for them all. He turned the roan into a thicket, carefully laid Sadie down in a hollow lined with pine branches and snow-lashed grass, kissed her damp hair and whispered, "Stay quiet, little one. I'll bring her back." Her lashes flickered, but she did not wake. He crawled through the timber, rifle in his hand, every sense as sharp as it was when he hunted game in the lean winters. The cabin loomed closer, smoke spilling from its crooked chimney, rough voices carrying on the wind. He heard laughter, the scrape of a chair, and then the muffled sound of someone coughing. It was a woman's cough, raw and broken, his breath caught in his throat. The world narrowed to that single sound. Clara. She was alive. His hands shook as he braced the rifle against a tree, his heart pounding with a violent mix of fury and relief. The outlaws' voices rolled on, careless, sure of their dominion in this wasteland, and Elias knew the time for waiting had come to an end. Behind him, the wind picked up again, snow whispering across the ground like a shroud being drawn. Ahead, the cabin door swung open, and one of the men stepped out, lighting a pipe, his back turned to the trees. Elias's finger curled against the cold trigger, but his eyes burned with the thought of what waited inside, of Clara in chains, and of Sadie, his Sadie, lying fevered in the cold. There was no turning back now. The trail had led him here, and it would end in fire, or it would end in freedom. The outlaw at the doorway struck his match, shielding it with his cupped palm as he puffed the pipe to light. The glow painted his ragged beard red for a moment before the wind snuffed it out. Elias held as still as stone, the rifle steady against his shoulder, just waiting for the moment the man turned and went back inside. When he did, Elias crept from the thicket, his boots sinking silent in the deep snow. He closed the distance to the back of the cabin, where a single shutter hung loose from its hinge. He peered through the gap, and his breath caught in his lungs. Clara sat inside. Her wrists were bound with rope to the leg of a heavy table. Her hair was longer and tangled, but her face was unmistakable. Gaunt, yes, but still carrying the same grace he had kissed 100, 1,000 times. She coughed again, that same hollow, weak sound, and bent her head as though she was praying. Rage and sorrow surged through him, so fierce he nearly kicked the door from its hinges right then and there. But he held fast. He forced himself to count the shadows. 3 men inside, one by the stove, one cleaning a pistol, another at the far wall, stacking crates. Clara shifted, and the lamplight caught the empty ribbon around her throat where the locket should have been. She reached for it instinctively, her fingers brushing the bare skin, and Elias's heart twisted in his chest. Sadie had carried it when she fled. It was the proof, the one thing that connected them all. He leaned his head against the frozen log wall, his eyes shut tight for one single heartbeat. Then he pulled back, his jaw set like granite. He could not wait another second. He slipped around to the front of the cabin, took a deep breath, and slammed the door open, the rifle already raised. The men jolted, curses flying. One of them reached for the pistol on the table, but Elias's shot cracked like thunder, splintering the wood an inch from the outlaw's hand. "Drop it!" he barked, his voice low and deadly. The pistol clattered to the floor. Clara gasped, her eyes widening as she saw him, pure, raw disbelief flooding her face. "Elias!" she whispered, as though she were naming a ghost. The sound of his name on her lips after a year of silence struck him harder than the rifle's recoil. "It's me, Clara. I'm here." For a moment, the world stood still. Her eyes were brimming with tears, the chains between them vanishing in that single, soul-deep look. But the spell broke as another outlaw lunged, swinging a long knife. Elias swung the rifle like a club, the heavy butt cracking against the man's jaw, sending him sprawling to the floor. The third man drew his gun and fired. The bullet tore through Elias's sleeve, grazing his arm with a flash of hot pain. But he fired back. The blast echoed through the small cabin, and the man toppled backward into the crates. The lamp shattered, and thick, oily smoke began to curl toward the ceiling. Clara cried out, struggling against the ropes that held her. Elias dropped the rifle just long enough to grab the fallen knife and slash her bonds. His fingers were fumbling but fierce. Just as she was free, the door burst open and the pipe-smoking outlaw charged back in, his gun raised. Elias shoved Clara behind him and fired again. The shot rang so loud the rafters shook. The man fell hard, his weapon skidding across the floorboards. Silence followed, broken only by Clara's ragged sobs and the hiss of the broken, burning lamp. Elias turned, his hands trembling as he reached out and touched her face. "You're alive," he whispered, disbelieving it even as he felt the warmth of her skin. She clung to him, her body frail, her breath shallow. "Sadie," she gasped, desperation cutting right through the reunion. "Where is she?" Elias swallowed hard, pulling her close. "She found me, Clara. She's safe, but she's sick." Clara's knees buckled then, her strength finally failing her. Elias caught her in his arms, lifting her as the cabin filled with the stench of smoke and gunpowder. Outside, the snow was falling steady again, the world muffled and white. But within that small, violent space, Elias knew the storm had only just begun. For though he had found her, fate would not let them go unscarred. Elias staggered out into the night with Clara in his arms. The cabin door banged shut on its hinges behind him, smoke spilling through the broken window into the falling snow. Snowflakes stung his face as the cold bit deep into the gash on his arm, but he hardly felt it. Clara's body was frighteningly light, her breath shallow and ragged against his chest. "Stay with me," he muttered, tightening his grip, trudging through the deep drifts toward the hollow where he had left Sadie hidden. Behind him, he heard the groan of timbers and then a shout. The last outlaw. He wasn't dead yet, and he was dragging himself from the wreckage of the cabin. A shot rang out, whistling past Elias's head and biting a chunk of bark from a pine tree just beside him. He dropped to one knee, propping Clara against a stump, and swung his rifle around, firing back into the dark. The crack echoed off the silent hills and was answered only by a curse and then silence. The wind swallowed the rest, but Elias knew the man was not finished, not yet. He scooped Clara up again, pushing forward until he reached the hollow. Sadie was stirring under the blankets, her eyes glassy with fever, but widening when she saw them. "Mama!" The cry was so small, so full of pain and hope, it broke Elias's chest. Clara's head lifted faintly, her lips forming the name she must have whispered 1,000 times in her fevered dreams. "Sadie." Elias laid her down beside the child, and for a moment, mother and daughter just clutched each other, their tears freezing on their cheeks as quickly as they fell. The sight stabbed him with both a profound joy and a sharp terror, for Clara's strength was nearly spent. He could see it fading from her eyes. "We can't linger," he said, his voice raw. He bundled them both in blankets and somehow tied them across the roan's back. He mounted with care, one arm steadying Clara, the other gripping the reins. Behind them, the cabin door slammed again. A figure stumbled out into the snow, a rifle glinting in the weak gray light. The outlaw raised it, a dark shadow against the white landscape. Elias kicked the roan hard. The horse lunged into a gallop just as the crack of gunfire split the night. Snow exploded beside them, but they rode on, the wind tearing at Elias's coat, Clara's faint moans in his ear. Saudi was clutching the locket as though it alone was the thing that kept them alive. The chase thundered behind them, hoofbeats pounding as the last man mounted his own horse and pursued. Elias bent low over the horse's neck, urging the roan faster, weaving through the dark pines, snow spraying up from every stride. Bullets hissed past them. One tore through his hat brim, another nicked the saddle leather just below his leg. Rage surged hot and pure through his veins. He would not lose them now. Not after clawing Clara back from those chains, not after finding Sadie half dead in the snow. He reined the horse sharp toward the frozen creek bed. The horse slid down the steep bank, its hooves striking the slick ice. The outlaw followed, his own mount skidding, the man cursing loud as he fought for balance. Elias swung his rifle one-handed and fired back into the night. The shot struck true. The outlaw's cry shattered the stillness as he tumbled from the saddle, rolling across the ice until stillness finally claimed him. Silence fell, save for the roar of his own breath and the pounding of the roan's heart. Elias slowed the horse, guiding it into the shelter of a bluff, snow drifting around them like ghosts in the twilight. He dismounted, carefully lowering Clara and Sadie into the lee of the rock face, checking Clara's face in the pale moonlight. She smiled faintly, her lips bloodied. "You came," she whispered. He touched his forehead to hers, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "I'll never leave again." Sadie pressed the locket into her mother's hand, and Clara closed her fingers weakly around it, as though the small circle of silver could somehow bind them whole again. For a moment, in that frozen, silent hollow, they were together at last, a family. But Elias knew the storm was not finished, not by a long shot. Clara's breath rattled, shallow and wet in her chest, and even as she clutched her daughter's hand, her life was slipping away like snow melting on warm stone. The bluff gave them shelter from the wind, but it offered no shelter from fate. Elias spread his own coat across the snow, laying Clara gently against it, while Saadi clung to her hand, whispering over and over, "Mama, don't leave me. Don't leave me." Clara's eyes fluttered open. Her face was as pale as the moon in the night sky. Her lips trembled as she drew the locket to her chest. "Saadi, my brave girl, I knew you'd find him." Elias knelt close, his hand pressing against the wound in her side where blood was still seeping through her dress, staining the snow a dark, terrible color. "Save your strength," he urged, though his voice cracked on the words. The lie was plain to both of them. "We'll get you home. I'll fetch the doctor." She smiled faintly then, an expression so soft and so full of pain it broke him. "Always promising more than a man can give, Elias." Sadie sobbed, clinging tighter, her little fingers getting smeared with her mother's blood, as if she could hold her life inside by touch alone. Clara cupped her daughter's cheek weakly, her thumb brushing away a tear. "Don't be afraid, Sadie. Papa's here." The word stunned Elias. It pierced him deeper than the cold, deeper than the bullet graze on his arm. He had been her husband. He was not this child's father. Or was he? He stared at Clara, a thousand questions burning in his eyes, but she gave him no chance to ask. "She is yours now, Elias. Yours to guard. Yours to raise. I gave her the locket so she'd find you. I knew you'd come." Her body trembled, blood wetting the silver locket until it gleamed dark in the light of the stars. "They told me you'd never come for me, that you'd turned away, but I held on, because I knew they lied." Elias gripped her hand, his tears freezing on his lashes. I should have searched sooner. I should have never believed the river had taken you. Clara shook her head faintly. No, you lived. And she lived. That was enough. She pulled Sadie close again, whispering into her hair. Be brave for him, my sweet girl, and always keep the locket. It carries more than just a picture. It carries a love that doesn't die. Her eyes turned to Elias one last time, and in them he saw both forgiveness and a final desperate plea. Promise me, she whispered, her voice breaking. Promise me you'll raise her as your own. Elias's chest heaved, his throat raw with grief. He pressed his forehead to hers, whispering, I swear it, on my life, Clara. She'll never want for love. Her lips parted in a final weary smile, and then her breath slipped out into the cold air, vanishing into the night. Sadie screamed, clutching her, shaking her, as if she could call her back from that dark place. But Elias gathered the small, sobbing girl into his arms, pulling her close while his own tears coursed down his face. She's gone, little one, he choked out. But her love isn't. It's here, in you and in me. The locket glimmered between them, slick with her mother's blood. Elias lifted it, pressing it back into Sadie's palm. This is hers, and now it's yours. Keep it always. It will remind you she never let go. The child sobbed into his chest, and he just rocked her, his own body shaking with the force of his sorrow. The snow around them was stained red, as if the land itself had borne witness to their tragedy. Above them, the stars shone cold and distant. But Elias felt Clara's presence in the hush between Sadie's cries. He closed his eyes, whispering into the night, Rest easy, my love. I'll keep her safe. The vow bound him tighter than chains, stronger than death itself. And as the wind rose again, he held the girl against his heart, the locket pressed between them, like a covenant no storm could ever break. Dawn broke pale across the prairie. The storm clouds had scattered, leaving the snowdrifts gleaming like endless, silent graves. Elias stood at the bluff with Sadie pressed against his side, the small locket clutched in her hand as though it were the last ember of warmth left in the entire world. Clara's body lay wrapped in his coat, still and silent, the blood a dark stain against the white snow. And for a long time he could not move. He could not think beyond the hollow, throbbing ache that had taken root in his chest. Sadie leaned into him, her face hidden, her small shoulders shaking with sobs too deep for her young years. He bent and kissed the top of her head, whispering words he didn't even know he remembered. Hush now, little one. You've still got me. I'll see you through. His voice broke, but the vow rang true in the cold air, forged in the fire of an impossible loss. He lifted Clara at last, laying her gently across the roan's back. Her weight was so light it felt like he was carrying a memory rather than flesh and bone. Sadie clung to his hand as they walked, step by slow step through the snow, leaving a trail behind them that the wind soon tried to cover, to erase. At the ranch house, he laid Clara upon the buffalo robe before the fire, closing her eyes with trembling fingers. He whispered a prayer, his tears falling hot onto her cold hair. And then he wrapped her again, knowing the frozen earth outside would have to take her before the day's end. Sadie knelt beside him, clutching the locket to her chest, whispering, She said you'd be my papa now. Elias gathered her into his arms, pressing his face into her hair, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and snow. She was right. You'll never be alone, Sadie. Not while I draw breath. The words bound him, not as a burden, but as a gift. It was a way to honor the love that had been stolen from him, and the love that remained. Together they carried Clara to the small grove of cottonwoods by the creek. The soil, though frozen, yielded to Elias's spade beneath the weak winter sun. Each strike of the blade jarred his bones, but he worked until the grave was dug, until the land made room for the woman who had been his joy, his grief, and his redemption. They laid her down gently. Sadie placed the locket on top of her chest for just a moment, a final goodbye, before Elias pressed it back into the child's hand. She wanted you to keep it. It's yours now. Always. The girl nodded, tears streaking her face, and curled her small fingers around the silver as though she were holding her mother's heart. Elias filled the grave, each shovel of earth as heavy as his own sorrow, until at last the mound stood beneath the bare trees, the snow drifting softly across it like a final, clean shroud. He stood there with Sadi's hand in his, the wind quiet now, and spoke aloud into the cold. "Rest easy, Clara. I'll keep my promise." As the sun broke weakly through the clouds, Sadi leaned against him, her small body fragile yet unyielding, and Elias felt the stirrings of something he had thought long dead with Clara. A reason to keep breathing, a reason to keep fighting. Together they walked back to the cabin, the fire within calling them home. And as the door closed behind them, shutting out the cold, the locket glimmered against Sadie's chest. It was no longer a token of loss, but of a love reborn in her keeping. Elias sat her on his knee, holding her close, and in the quiet hush of the cabin, he whispered the words that would guide every single step they took from that day forward. "You are mine now, Sadi, and I am yours. Whatever storms rise, we will face them together." The wind rattled faintly against the shutters, but inside the warmth grew steady, and the story of a widow's locket ended, right where another story began, with a child safe in her father's arms and a covenant sealed in snow and tears. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales that get right to the heart of the matter, and let us know in the comments. If you had found that locket in the child's hand, would you have believed it meant your lost love still lived?